Salam, peace be upon you. Pattern is the foundation of public reality. Before objects, laws, or observers, there must be comparability, the lawful possibility of difference. Part 2 names that primitive condition. Part 2 Primitive Comparability, the origin of phi pattern. Let us begin with a question so simple that most people never ask it. When you look at the world and notice anything at all, a face, a tree, a star, a sound, a memory, a pattern in numbers, what had to be true before that noticing was possible? Not what had to be true before the object existed. Not what had to be true before the measurement was made. What had to be true before any difference could appear as a difference? This is where part 2 begins. Part 1 showed us a difficult inversion. Pattern is not decoration on top of reality. Pattern is the condition under which reality becomes publicly identifiable. Objects, laws, and observers all depend on pattern. They do not stand before it. Now part 2 asks the next unavoidable question. If pattern is primary, then what is the most primitive condition that makes pattern possible? What is the first permission? The answer in phi pattern science is phi. But to understand phi properly, we must move slowly, because this is exactly where confusion begins. If we rush, we will turn phi into a thing, a force, an energy, a mystical object, or a poetic metaphor. And all of those are mistakes. So let us go carefully. Imagine a child learning to speak. At first, the world is a flood. Sounds, colors, movements, faces, touch, light, shadows. Slowly, the child begins to separate things. Mother, cup, door, bird, hot, cold, again. That separation feels natural to us because we've done it for so long. But if you look closely, something astonishing is happening. The child is not merely naming things. The child is first learning that this can be told apart from that. Before cup is a word, there must be a difference between cup and not cup. Before bird is a word, there must be a difference between the moving thing in the sky and the still branch. Before any naming, there is distinction. And this is not only true for children. It is true for physicists in laboratories, for biologists in the field, for mathematicians proving theorems, for musicians composing melodies, for civilizations building sciences. All knowledge begins with comparability. If nothing could be distinguished from anything else, there would be no observation, no counting, no law, no memory, no speech, no science. So part 2 is about that deepest layer, the possibility of distinction itself. What cannot be primitive? One of the best ways to understand what is fundamental is to test what cannot be fundamental. We usually think in terms of big candidates. Maybe reality begins with objects, maybe with laws, maybe with observers, maybe with matter, maybe with mind. Phi pattern science asks us to audit these starting points and check whether they secretly depend on something deeper. Can objects be primitive? Suppose we say reality begins with objects. It sounds reasonable. A rock is a rock, a tree is a tree, a planet is a planet. But what makes something an object at all? To call something an object, you must already be able to identify it as distinct from what surrounds it. You must be able to say where it begins and where it ends. You must be able to tell this thing from that thing. That means objecthood already presupposes distinguishability. If no difference could be recognized, there would be no object. there would be no thing to point to. So objects cannot be primitive in the foundational sense. They are already structured outcomes of comparability. Objects come after the possibility of distinction. Can laws be primitive? What if we say reality begins with laws? Gravity, electromagnetism, quantum rules, mathematical order. Again, this sounds strong. Laws seem deeper than objects. But what is a law? A law is a statement that some relation holds consistently across cases. It says, in effect, this kind of situation behaves like that kind of situation. Or, when these conditions repeat, this structure appears again. To say that, you must already be able to compare cases. You must already have sameness and difference. You must already be able to identify regularity. Without comparability, law cannot even be stated. So laws cannot be primitive either. Laws are already pattern statements. They depend on prior distinguishability. Can observers be primitive? What if we start with the observer? Perhaps consciousness, perception, or awareness is the foundation. But what does an observer do? An observer detects differences. This changed. That stayed the same. This signal is stronger. That event happened before this one. This mark means danger. That mark means food. An observer who could not detect difference would not observe anything. So observation itself presupposes comparability. Observers are not prior to distinction. Observers are systems that operate within distinction. So observers too cannot be primitive in the foundational sense. If objects, laws, and observers all presuppose distinguishability, then we must go deeper than all three. We need the minimal condition that makes any public structure possible. That minimal condition is not yet an object, not yet a law, not yet an observer, not yet a measurement, not yet a meaning. It is simply this: the lawful possibility that this differs from that. That is the primitive requirement. Notice how little is being claimed and how much is being opened. We are not yet claiming what differs. We are not yet claiming how much it differs. We are not yet claiming why it differs. We are not yet claiming a geometry, a metric, a time axis, or a physical mechanism. Only this: difference can be lawfully possible and publicly trackable in principle. This is the first permission. This is what Part 2 names phi. Introducing phi. In phi pattern science, phi is the primitive token for comparability, the root permission for distinction. Phi is not the pattern itself. Phi is what makes pattern possible. Phi is not one more thing in the world. Phi is the condition under which there can be a world that is publicly intelligible. If Part 1 said pattern must come first, Part 2 now says pattern begins in primitive comparability. This is the first serious move of the framework. And because this move is so foundational, we must immediately install strong firewalls around it. Why? Because the mind hates primitives. The mind wants to picture them, decorate them, physicalize them, moralize them, mystify them. It wants phi to be something familiar. But if we allow that too early, we smuggle later concepts into the foundation and corrupt the framework before it begins. So the next step is a disciplined negative definition. The cleanest way to protect phi at this stage is to say clearly what it is not. Phi is not a substance. It is not made of anything. It is not a hidden material. It is not a cosmic fluid. It is not the finest dust of reality. Substance language already belongs to later layers, where things can be identified, counted, and tracked. Phi is what makes such identification possible in the first place. So if we treat phi as a substance, we are using object language before objecthood is grounded. That is smuggling. Phi is not energy. Energy is a powerful concept, but it is already a structured physical quantity. It depends on a framework: states, transformations, equations, conservation, bookkeeping. Phi is prior to all that. If someone says phi is energy, they have silently imported physics into the primitive layer. That is not a small mistake. It destroys the point of having a primitive at all. Phi is not spacetime. Spacetime is a way of organizing events through coordinates and relations. Even if one treats spacetime as fundamental in physics, it is still a structured framework with distinctions, intervals, and lawful comparisons. Phi is prior to any such arena. Phi is not inside space. Phi is not flowing through time. Space and time in this framework will later be read as pattern expressions, not used as primitive containers. So giving phi hidden space or time content is forbidden at this stage. Phi is not consciousness. Because phi concerns distinction, some may be tempted to say, then phi is awareness. But that is also a mistake. Consciousness is a rich pattern phenomenon, recursive, embodied, memory-bearing, interaction-dependent. It belongs much later, after patterns, persistence, observation, and modeling are installed. Phi is not a mental state. Phi is not a soul. Phi is not subjective experience. Phi is the primitive possibility of distinction that makes even consciousness thinkable. Phi is not an object. This must be repeated because it is the most common error. Phi is not a thing you can point to, not a hidden particle, not a secret field, not an invisible agent. If you can imagine phi as an object among objects, you have already moved too far ahead. Phi is the condition for objecthood, not another member of the object collection. Phi is not a field. Fields already assume structured variation over a domain. They presuppose the ability to compare values across regions. That is already pattern-laden. Phi comes before fields in the order of foundational explanation. So phi field talk is not allowed at this primitive stage unless it is explicitly marked as a later interpretive layer. Why this negative discipline matters. At this point, someone might ask, why spend so much time saying what phi is not? Why not just move on? Because this is where entire frameworks quietly fail. Most foundational systems become unstable not because they lack brilliance, but because they allow hidden imports at the root. Later ideas sneak into earlier definitions. The foundation starts borrowing from the house it is supposed to support. Then the system looks coherent, but only because it is circular in the bad sense. It assumes what it claims to derive. Phi pattern science blocks that move here. Part 2 is not merely introducing a concept. It is installing an anti-smuggling baseline for the whole framework. That baseline says, do not import physical primitives into the primitive layer. Do not import semantic meaning into the primitive layer. Do not import observer privilege into the primitive layer. Do not reify the primitive into an object. This is why Part 2 is simple but severe. It names very little, but it protects everything that comes later. The silent gap in music. A melody can help us feel this. When you hear music, you hear notes, rhythm, intervals, tension, release. But a melody is not just a pile of notes. It depends on distinctions between notes. This pitch versus that pitch. This beat versus that beat. Sound versus silence. If all tones collapsed into an undifferentiated blur, melody would disappear. Now, ask a deeper question. Before any melody can exist, what must be present? Not a specific note, not a specific song, not even a scale. What must be present is the possibility that one sound can differ from another and be tracked as such. That possibility is like phi. Phi is not the melody. Phi is not the note. Phi is not the instrument. Phi is the primitive permission that difference can become legible. Without that permission, no music. With it, music becomes possible. Another analogy, a blank page that can receive a mark. Imagine a blank page. Before you write a word, draw a line, or sketch a shape, something must already be possible. One part of the page can become different from another. A mark can appear. A contrast can be made. A distinction can hold. Now imagine the opposite. A page with no possibility of distinction at all. No here and there, no marked and unmarked, no contrast, no separation. On such a page, nothing could be written. Not because your hand is weak, but because distinction itself is unavailable. Phi is like the primitive permission of markability, not the mark, not the ink, not the text, but the possibility that difference can appear at all. And once you see this, you begin to understand why phi is not mystical. It is simply foundational. Phi at every scale. Because phi is primitive comparability, it is not tied to one scale or one scientific field. It is the root condition beneath them all. At the smallest scales we study, physicists distinguish events, states, and outcomes. Even uncertainty requires comparability. This possible outcome versus that possible outcome. At the atomic scale, chemistry depends on differences in structure, bonding, arrangement, and reaction pathways. No difference, no chemistry. At the biological scale, life depends on distinction everywhere. Cell membrane versus environment, self versus non-self, signal versus noise, food versus toxin. A living system is in many ways a disciplined comparator. At the human scale, language depends on distinguishable sounds, gestures, marks, and meanings. If every word were indistinguishable from every other, speech would collapse instantly. At the social scale, institutions depend on distinctions: valid, invalid, true, false, public, private, lawful, unlawful. Civilization itself is structured comparability. At the cosmic scale, astronomy depends on distinguishing one signal from background, one pattern of light from another, one distribution from another. The universe becomes knowable only because differences can be tracked. So when we say phi is primitive comparability, we are not introducing the niche idea. We are naming the deepest shared precondition of all knowability. It matters that we call phi a permission. Why not call it a force? Because force already acts on things. Why not call it a law? Because law already compares cases. Why not call it a structure? Because structure is already patterned. Permission is cleaner. It names the enabling status without pretending to specify more than we know at this stage. Think of a game board before a game begins. The rules of legal moves define what may happen. That legal possibility is not itself a move. It is not a piece. It is not the game state. But without it, there is no game. Phi is analogous to that foundational legality, but more primitive still. It is the lawful possibility that distinction can happen and matter. This is why the language must remain disciplined. The permission is real in the framework sense, but it is not a thing. The rigor layer of Part 2. Part 2 is not an empirical claim like water boils at this temperature, and it is not yet a formal mathematical claim like Part 3 will begin to install. It is a primitive declaration at the pattern foundational layer. That means several rigor conditions must be kept in place. First, type discipline. Phi is a primitive token, not a measurable quantity. We do not ask for its mass, speed, location, or energy. Those questions are category mistakes at this stage. Second, scope firewall. Part 2 operates in a pre-physical, pre-semantic, pre-observer privilege register. If we slip in matter, meaning, or mind as explanatory defaults, we violate the scope. Third, anti-smuggling gate. Any definition of phi that uses later concepts, time, metric, space, force, consciousness, semantics, is refused as foundationally illegal. Fourth, well-formedness gate. The concept must remain coherent. Phi must be introduced as the possibility of distinction, not as a vague poetic placeholder for everything. This rigor is not bureaucracy. It is precision in the birthplace of the framework. We must refuse. A mature foundation must know how it can be misread. Part 2 therefore includes clear refusal conditions. We refuse progression if phi is defined using later concepts. For example, phi is a special energy field in space. That uses physics to define what is meant to ground physics. We refuse progression if phi is given hidden metric, time, or space content. Those belong later. We refuse progression if phi is treated as an object-like substance. That reifies the primitive and breaks the order of explanation. We refuse progression if phi becomes a mystical entity, a symbolic idol, or a catch-all word for wonder. The framework is profound, but it is not protected by vagueness. Our refusal here is a success of discipline. It protects the science from collapsing into projection. By the end of Part 2, something quiet but irreversible has happened. We now have a primitive. We can say with precision. Pattern begins in comparability, not in things. Phi names the primitive permission for lawful distinction. Phi is not a substance, energy, space-time, consciousness, object, or field. The foundation is now protected against hidden imports from higher layers. This gives the framework a real starting point. Without Part 2, pattern first remains a philosophical slogan. With Part 2, it becomes a disciplined foundational program. You first crack in uniformity. Imagine absolute, undifferentiated sameness. No this, no that, no contrast, no edge, no before, no after, no mark, no signal. Not darkness, because darkness is already distinguishable from light. Not silence, because silence is already distinguishable from sound. Simply no public distinction at all. In such a condition, nothing can appear, not because there are no objects, but because objecthood itself has nowhere to begin. Now imagine the first lawful crack in that undifferentiation. Not a thing, not an event in time, but the primitive permission that distinction can hold. This, not that. Difference can be. Comparability can begin. That is the role of phi in the framework. Not the first object, not the first law, not the first observer. The first permission. And from that permission, pattern can begin. But a bare permission is not yet enough to generate the rich world of patterns we actually study. If phi is primitive comparability, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What shape must primitive comparability take if patterns are to become cyclic, stable, countable, and globally meaningful? Why do loops matter? Why do returns matter? How can continuity produce integer structure? Part 3 will answer by introducing one of the deepest moves in the whole framework. Phi is not merely comparability. Phi is circular comparability. Primitive comparability is S1 shaped. And once that is seen, winding, holonomy, defects, and global pattern memory become possible. That is where the story goes next. Primitive comparability, the origin of phi pattern. Always, peace be upon you.